guard on shore to protect the cooks, and a guard in the boat, fastened the pirogues to the boat. I call this island Bad-Humored Island, as we were in a bad humor. The journals for the next day say: "Our conduct yesterday seemed to have inspired the Indians with fear of us, and as we were desirous of cultivating their acquaintance, we complied with their wish that we should give them an opportunity of treating us well, and also suffer their squaws and children to see us and our boat, which would be perfectly new to them. Accordingly, we came to on the south side, where a crowd of men, women, and children were waiting to receive us. Captain Lewis went on shore and remained several hours, and observing that their disposition was friendly, we resolved to remain during the night for a dance, which they were preparing for us. The two officers were received on shore by 10 well-dressed young men, who took them up in a decorated robe, and carried them in state to the council house. There the pipe of peace was smoked, a ceremonious dog feast was prepared, the chieftains delivered themselves of speeches, divided between fawning adulation and flamboyant boasting, and then came a sort of state ball, which continued until midnight. The next morning the travelers were suffered to proceed. That was a notable encounter. The Tetons have always been counted among the most irresponsible villains of their race, treacherous by first impulse, murderous by strongest inclination, thievish according to opportunity, combining the effrontery of Italian beggars with the boldness begotten by their own sanguinary history. Yet this determined little band faced them in the heart of their own land, and overawed them. For many days thereafter, parties of the Tetons appeared from time to time upon the river banks, following the boats, begging, threatening, doing everything in their power to harass the advance. No doubt they had already repented of their brief show of decency, and would have made an open demonstration had they dared. Through those days the men generally encamped upon islands or sandbars in midstream, deeming it wise to avoid further contact with the tribe. It was a decided relief to get beyond their territory. On October 10th they reached the land of the Ricaras, a tribe whose conduct, in all domestic and foreign relations, was in striking contrast to that of the Sioux, and indeed almost unique. The Ricaras could not be induced to drink whiskey. Soon after the arrival at the Ricara villages, one of the privates was tried by court-martial for some act of insubordination, and was sentenced to be publicly whipped. The execution of the sentence affected the Indian chief very sensibly, for he cried aloud during the punishment. When the matter was explained to him, he acknowledged that examples were necessary, and that he himself had given them by punishing with death. But his nation never whipped even children from their birth. Universal sobriety and compassionate tears from the eyes of a warrior. Surely that tribe was curious. By the last of October the travelers came to the camps of the Mandans and the Minnetarees, 1,600 miles from St. Louis, and there, being warned by the calendar and by cold, they prepared to take up winter quarters. Their first care was to find a suitable place for building log cabins and fortifications. With this work the men were engaged until November 20th, when Fort Mandan was completed and occupied. Meanwhile the officers had sought to extend acquaintance among the Indians, and to establish confidence and bring them into sympathy with the new conditions of government. So far as pledges were concerned, they were fairly successful. The Indians received them hospitably. The Mandans had once been a powerful nation, living in numerous villages down the river. But continued wars with the Sioux, coupled with sad ravages of the smallpox, had reduced them to an insignificant number, and compelled them to remove out of easy reach of their strongest enemies. When Lewis and Clark came upon them, They formed only a trifling souvenir of their past grandeur. They had then but two poor villages at this remote site, where they lived in a precarious hand-to-mouth fashion, having no allies but a small force of Minnetarees near by. But fate had managed the matter very well, no doubt, in depriving these people of effective strength in war, for at this time the head chief of the Minnetaree villages was a man who, given opportunity, would have made the river run red with the blood of his enemies. This was Le Borgne, a one-eyed old despot of surpassing cruelty and bloodthirstiness, whose very name, even in his present position, would compel a shiver of apprehension. A chief such as he, at the head of forces matched to his ferocious desires, would have changed the history of the upper Missouri. As it was, he spent most of his villainous instincts for his own private amusement, occasionally slaughtering one of his warriors who had given him displeasure, or butchering a couple of his wives whose society had grown irksome; and between times he leered with his solitary evil eye upon the traders, contriving ways of getting whiskey with which to bait his passions. The British traders of the Hudson Bay and Northwest Companies had long before secured a strong foothold in this territory, and had sought by every means to monopolize the traffic. The ubiquitous French were there also, domiciled in the villages, and some of them had taken squaws to wife. With schooling from such as these, old Le Borgne had cut his wisdom teeth. He had made himself master of many low tricks and subtleties practiced by white traders and vagabonds. He was as skilful as the best of them in making promises, and as skilful as the worst in breaking them. He was a scamp and a blackguard. Lewis and Clark succeeded directly in effecting a treaty of peace between the Mandans and Ricaras, and among other small tribes of the region round about, but they were powerless in trying to reconcile these people to the Sioux, who were the bogeymen of the plains, and who conducted themselves in every affair of peace or war with the arrogance of incontestable power. Not death itself could extinguish the hatred that was felt for them by the weaker tribes, compelled to skulk and tremble. Early in November the officers received a visit from two squaws, who had been taken prisoners by the Mandans, many years before, in a war with the Snake Indians of the Rocky Mountains. One of these squaws was named Sacajawea, the Bird Woman. She had been but a child at the time of her capture, when she had been taken to the Mandan villages and there sold to a Frenchman known as Chaboneau, who kept her until she reached womanhood and then married her. She was destined to play a considerable part in the later work of the expedition, and to lend to it one of its few elements of true romance. The winter was passed busily, but for the most part quietly. The men suffered no serious deprivation. Game was abundant, and one member of the party, who was a good amateur blacksmith, set up a small forge, where he turned out a variety of tools, implements, and trinkets, which were traded to the Indians for corn. Everything went well. The officers were as busy as the men, and their occupations were varied and vital. They found difficulty in getting credit for the news they bore that the government of the United States was to be thereafter in fact, as well as in name, the controlling agency in administering the affairs of the territory and in regulating trade. To make the Indian mind ready to receive this lesson, it was first necessary to correct the evils bred by the earlier short-sighted rule of the Spanish, and to uproot a strong predisposition in favor of the British traders. The Hudson Bay Company had been in existence since 1670, and the Northwest Company since 1787, and they were not inclined to surrender their control of trade without a struggle. Aside from this task, the two youthful men of all work were continually engaged in gathering material for a report upon the ethnology of the upper Missouri and the plains. They have left to us a